The cold evening air bit sharply as the sun dipped behind the jagged mountains, casting long shadows across the narrow wooden bridge. A faint rustle of leaves whispered secrets to the wind, but beneath this quiet symphony, an uneasy stillness had settled. Somewhere in the distance, a soft, desperate cry pierced the silence. Fragile, urgent, almost human. The sound seemed out of place here, in the remote wilderness where life moved slowly and the nights stretched endlessly. At the edge of the bridge, a small figure trembled, its grey fur damp and matted. The wolf cub's wide amber eyes darted nervously, reflecting the fading light like twin embers. It was barely more than a shadow against the towering pines, its tiny body precariously balanced on the narrow planks, its paws skittering for purchase. The bridge creaked ominously beneath the weight of unseen memories, as if warning of the fragile line between safety and disaster. Nearby, a lone man stood frozen, his breath shallow and uneven. His face was etched with worry, eyes fixed on the trembling creature just inches away from the abyss below. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, torn between reaching out and holding back. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken fears and past regrets, as if the very air waited for something unspeakable to unfold. Above, the sky deepened to a bruised purple, and the first stars began to pierce the twilight veil. Somewhere close, a branch snapped, sending a flock of startled birds into frantic flight. The cub flinched, lost its footing for a heartbeat, and then gravity claimed it. Time seemed to slow in that suspended moment, a breath held tight between hope and despair. But as the cub tumbled downward, something unexpected shattered the fragile thread of fear. A sudden movement, swift and sure, broke the silence, a presence unseen but deeply felt. The night, once poised to swallow the small life whole, now whispered of hope, of survival, and of a bond forged in the unlikeliest of moments. The darkness waited, watching as the first shock of what had just happened rippled through the stillness. The wolf cub's fall was arrested not by chance, but by a swift, sure force, a dark blur that shot beneath the bridge, catching the small creature in a cradle of powerful limbs. A man's breath hitched sharply, the tension in his chest unraveling just enough to allow a shaky exhale. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath too, the rustling leaves stilled in a fragile truce between hope and fear. That man, Thomas, stood rooted, yet trembling. His rugged frame was draped in a worn leather jacket, the faded fabric telling stories of years spent battling the elements and his own restless past. His hands, calloused and scarred, had once wielded tools in a bustling workshop, but now they hovered uncertainly over the edge of the bridge, hesitant to reach out, haunted by memories he refused to confront. Thomas wasn't a man easily shaken, yet tonight the wildness of this moment had stirred something dormant within him, something fragile, urgent. The wolf cub, still cradled in the protective embrace of a figure emerging from the shadows beneath the bridge, blinked up at the dim sky with wide, bewildered eyes. Its tiny body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the shock of sudden rescue. The figure was a woman, slender and lithe, her dark hair cascading in loose waves that caught the last glimmers of twilight. Her eyes, sharp and steady, held an ancient calm, an understanding forged from years spent living on the fringe of this wilderness, where man and nature collided and intertwined in uneasy harmony. Her name was Ilara. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged here, whose every step was measured and mindful of the land's whispered secrets. The forest was her home, but it was also her prison, a place of solace and isolation. Ilara's past was stitched with threads of loss and survival. She had come to these woods to escape the clamor of human life, to find a space where pain could be softened by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of owls. But solitude had its own burdens, and the sudden presence of the cub and of Thomas was a crack in the carefully constructed walls around her heart. Thomas's gaze flicked between Ilara and the cub, a silent question hanging between them. His voice, when it came, was rough but gentle. "Is it hurt?" The words felt clumsy, inadequate in the face of the fragile life cradled before them. Ilara's fingers, steady and sure, brushed a strand of fur away from the cub's face. "No broken bones," she said softly, "but it's scared. It's alone." Her eyes darkened with a mix of empathy and something deeper, regret, perhaps, or a memory she was reluctant to share. The bridge above groaned again, the wind picking up and setting the wooden planks to creak beneath their feet. Thomas shifted, heart uneasy. There was a weight to this moment beyond the immediate danger, a tension that seemed to seep from the shadows themselves. He glanced back toward the path he'd taken to reach the bridge, where footprints were already fading into the gathering dusk. The isolation of the forest pressed in around them, a reminder of how far they were from help, from the world they had both tried to leave behind. Ilara's voice broke the silence, quieter now. "You shouldn't be here." It wasn't a warning, but a statement, heavy with meaning. Thomas swallowed hard, the old ache in his chest flaring, a mixture of guilt and defiance. He'd come seeking something, though what exactly had become unclear even to him. A flicker of something unspoken passed between them, a shared history written in the spaces between words, in the way their eyes avoided certain glances. Thomas had once known these woods intimately, had once walked these trails with a boyish certainty, now eroded by years of absence and regret. Ilara, who had stayed, had seen the forest change, had felt the slow encroachment of loneliness and danger. The cub whimpered softly, breaking the fragile silence. Thomas's hands itched to reach out, to offer comfort, but he hesitated, caught between the impulse to protect and the fear of overstepping a line he barely understood. Ilara watched him, her expression unreadable, as if weighing the risks of trust. Around them, the forest seemed to lean in closer, shadows deepening beneath the towering pines, whispering of secrets buried beneath layers of moss and time. The night carried a chill that seeped into their bones, but neither moved to break the stillness. Instead, they stood together on the edge of an uncertain moment, each wrestling with the ghosts that had led them here. In the quiet that followed, the distant howl of a lone wolf echoed, a haunting call that seemed both a warning and a promise. It was a sound that carried the weight of wildness and the fragile hope of connection, threading through the dense air like a fragile lifeline. The wolf cub nestled closer to Ilara, its amber eyes reflecting the flickering stars above, while Thomas's gaze remained fixed on the dark woods beyond, searching for answers he wasn't yet ready to face. The bridge, once a simple crossing, now felt like a threshold between past and future, fear and hope, isolation and unexpected kinship. And as the night deepened, so too did the silent question hanging between them all. What price would they pay for the fragile bond that had just begun to form in the shadow of the falling wolf cub? Ilara shifted the cub gently in her arms, her eyes flickering toward Thomas with a subtle, almost imperceptible hesitation. There was a tension in her posture now, a tightening around her shoulders that hadn't been there moments before. She hadn't spoken, but her silence was heavy with something unspoken, an invisible barrier rising between them, fragile yet firm. Thomas noticed it immediately, the way her grip on the cub stiffened, as if bracing against an unseen force. He stepped closer, the rough boards of the bridge creaking beneath his boots, breaking the fragile calm. "We can't just leave it here," he said, voice lower, rougher. But even as he spoke, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. His fingers twitched, as if fighting the urge to reach out and touch the cub, to bridge the distance, not just between himself and the animal, but between himself and Ilara. Yet the space between them remained charged, electric and uncertain. Ilara's gaze dropped to the dark forest floor below, shadows pooling like spilled ink around the roots of ancient pines. The wind stirred, carrying with it a scent that was faint but unmistakably metallic, like old blood mingled with damp earth. She inhaled sharply, her nostrils flaring as if the smell triggered something deep within her. For a moment, her eyes glazed over, distant and unfocused, as if caught in the grip of a memory she had no intention of sharing. Thomas caught the shift, the subtle change in her demeanor, and his heart tightened. He wanted to ask, to break through whatever wall had just risen, but the words lodged in his throat. Instead, he watched her closely, noticing the way her fingers curled around the cub's fur, almost possessively, a silent claim that unsettled him more than he expected. It wasn't just protection, It was something fiercer, something tangled with fear and maybe even guilt. A sudden rustle to their right jerked them both to attention. A low, almost imperceptible growl vibrated through the air, primal and raw. The cub's ears flattened, and it nuzzled closer to Ilara, seeking safety in the warmth of her body. Ilara's eyes narrowed, scanning the shadows beyond the edge of the bridge. Her breath hitched, a sharp, quick intake that betrayed a momentary panic beneath her calm exterior. Thomas followed her gaze but saw nothing, only the thick darkness pressing in like a living thing. "Did you hear that?" Ilara whispered, voice taut. Thomas nodded, swallowing the sudden dryness in his mouth. "Yeah." But even as he said it, a stubborn part of him rebelled against the fear creeping in. It was just the forest, nothing more. Yet, the unease clawed at his insides, a gnawing sensation that this night held more danger than the fall of a wolf cub. Ilara took a step back from the bridge's edge, her body rigid as if preparing for something unseen. Thomas noticed her fingers tightening into a fist, knuckles whitening. "You're tense," he said, softer now, trying to bridge the silent gulf between them. She didn't respond immediately. Then, without looking at him, she murmured, "There's been movement. Something I thought was long gone." Thomas frowned, the words stirring a flicker of confusion. Movement. Gone. His mind raced, but he held the questions back. This was her domain, her territory. He had no right to pry, yet the weight of those words settled heavily between them. The cub whimpered again, a small, plaintive sound that broke the spell. Thomas knelt slowly, extending a trembling hand toward the creature. Ilara's gaze snapped back to him, sharp and warning. "Wait," she said, voice a whisper, but edged with steel. "Not yet." He froze, caught between the impulse to reach out and the instinct to trust her judgment. The moment stretched thin, fragile as the thread of night air around them. In the silence, Thomas became acutely aware of every breath, every heartbeat, the subtle shift of muscles beneath his jacket. Something in Ilara's expression was different now, less guarded, more vulnerable, yet laced with a fierce determination that both drew Thomas in and kept him at bay. He wanted to ask what had changed, what the movement meant, but the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded, waiting. Above them, the wind picked up again, carrying a faint, eerie melody, a song of the forest, haunting and elusive. It wove through the branches, threading around them like a living presence. The cub's amber eyes caught the movement of the stars, reflecting a glimmer of something almost human, curiosity, or perhaps a spark of recognition. Thomas glanced at Ilara once more. For a brief, fleeting second, their eyes met, and in that glance was a silent admission. Neither of them knew what the night would demand of them, nor how far the fragile bond they were beginning to forge might stretch. The bridge beneath them groaned ominously, a reminder that the moment was fragile, that the path ahead was precarious. And yet, in the stillness, a quiet resolve began to take root, unspoken, uncertain, but real. Whatever shadows crept in from the forest's depths, they would face them together. For the cub, for the past they couldn't outrun, for the fragile hope that had dared to flicker to life in the darkness. The night pressed in close around them, thick and suffocating, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ilara's fingers tightened their grip on the wolf cub, whose small body quivered with each sharp intake of cold air. Thomas stood just a pace away, his eyes darting between the shadows beneath the bridge and Ilara's tense profile. The weight of unspoken fears settled between them, heavier than the dark canopy overhead. "Movement," Ilara had said. The word echoed in Thomas's mind, reverberating like a warning bell. He wanted to press her, to demand answers, but something deeper held him back, a fragile respect for the walls she'd built around herself. Suddenly, a faint, irregular tapping drew their attention. It came from the far side of the bridge, a subtle rhythm against the wooden planks that seemed almost deliberate. Ilara's eyes narrowed. "That's not the wind." Her voice was barely more than a breath, but it carried an edge sharp enough to cut through the silence. Thomas stepped forward, his boots cautious but steady. "Who's there?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying the tension he tried to mask. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie stillness that pressed down on them like a physical weight. Then came a soft, hurried shuffle, the sound of footsteps breaking through the underbrush. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man, gaunt and wild-eyed, his clothes torn and stained with mud and blood. His face was streaked with grime and sweat, lips chapped and cracked. He held something in his trembling hands, a crude, hand-carved wooden box, worn and weathered. Ilara's body stiffened, the wolf cub almost slipping from her arms as she instinctively clasped it tighter. Thomas's heart pounded, a mixture of fear and curiosity flooding through him. The stranger's eyes locked onto the cub, then flicked up to Ilara, a flicker of recognition. Or was it desperation in his gaze? "Please," the man croaked, voice ragged and urgent. "You have to help. They're coming. And they took her." Ilara's breath hitched. "Who took her?" she asked, voice low but steady. The man swallowed hard, glancing nervously over his shoulder as if expecting to see pursuers lurking in the dark. "The hunters, not the kind with guns or traps in Wixtin, but worse, men who deal in secrets and blood." Thomas frowned, confusion knitting his brow. "Hunters? What do you mean? This is just a forest. Who else is out here?" The stranger's eyes darted between the two of them. "You don't know the half of it," he said, voice dropping to a whisper. "There's a group, call themselves the Black Pines. They've been moving through these woods for months, tracking rare animals and people who get in their way. They took a girl, Ilara's girl." The name struck Thomas like a sudden blow. Ilara's girl. His gaze snapped to her, searching her face for a reaction. But Ilara's expression was unreadable. Her jaw clenched so tight it looked as though it might crack. "No," she breathed, voice barely audible. "It can't be." The man's gaze was pleading now. "She's alive, but they're holding her somewhere deep inside the forest, beyond the old logging trails. We don't have much time. They move fast, and they don't leave witnesses." Thomas swallowed, the pieces clicking into place like a grim puzzle. The movement Ilara sensed wasn't just an animal or the wind. It was something far more dangerous. The forest's silence had been broken by hunters, not hunters of game, but hunters of people. Ilara's hands trembled as she cradled the cub closer, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. "I thought I left that life behind," she whispered, voice thick with pain. "I thought I was safe here." The man nodded, his face haunted. "You can't run from them." "Not anymore." A new tension crackled in the air, sharper and more tangible than before. Thomas felt it coil around his ribs, squeezing tight. The isolated woods, the fragile bond between them and the cub, the ghosts of their pasts, all suddenly seemed insignificant compared to this new threat lurking in the shadows. Ilara took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We have to find her," she said, voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. "Before it's too late." Thomas's gaze flicked to the cub, whose amber eyes watched them with an almost knowing intensity. In that moment, the little creature was no longer just a symbol of fragile hope. It was a catalyst, a lifeline pulling them into a dangerous, uncertain fight. "We'll need supplies," Thomas said quietly, already calculating the odds. "And a plan." The man nodded. "I can guide you. I know the Black Pines paths. They're camps." Ilara's eyes met Thomas's, a silent question hanging between them. The path ahead was dark and uncertain, shadowed by threats they could barely comprehend. Yet, beneath the weight of fear, a resolve began to harden. A promise forged in the unlikeliest of places. The forest around them seemed to close in, the ancient trees bearing silent witness to the turning tide. The wolf cub whimpered softly, as if sensing the shift, and nestled deeper into Ilara's arms. Thomas exhaled slowly, the breath trembling but determined. The night had revealed its true face, one of danger, loss, and the raw, urgent need to fight back. The fragile thread of hope that had drawn them together now held the weight of survival. And as the first distant howl of a wolf sliced through the night, it was no longer just a call to the wild. It was a warning, a challenge, a beginning. The bridge beneath their feet groaned again, the old wood protesting the weight of the choices to come. But neither Thomas nor Ilara stepped back. Instead, they moved forward together, the cub nestled safely between them, a fragile spark against the encroaching dark. The forest was no longer just a place of solitude and secrets. It was a battleground, and they were running out of time. The weight of the stranger's words clung to the cool night air, settling like a thick fog around the trio beneath the bridge. For a long moment, silence reigned, deep and suffocating, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, unwilling to disturb the fragile stillness. Thomas's fingers twitched at his sides, restless but uncertain where to rest them, while Ilara's gaze dropped to the cub, her body rigid, trembling ever so slightly beneath her protective hold. The mention of the black pines, of hunters who trafficked in secrets and blood, carved a hollow ache through Thomas's chest. His mind raced, scrambling to reconcile the peaceful isolation he'd imagined with the dark reality now pressing in on all sides. This wasn't just a remote forest, it was a battleground layered with threats he'd never expected to confront again. The past he thought buried had clawed its way back up, uninvited and merciless. Ilara's eyes, fixed on the small furred shape in her arms, shone with a sorrow that made Thomas's throat tighten. He wanted to speak, to reach across the chasm of years and pain, but the words felt too fragile, too raw. Instead, he swallowed hard and stepped closer, the rough boards of the bridge groaning underfoot like whispered warnings. The cub whimpered softly, a fragile sound that fractured the heavy silence. Its body pressed harder against Ilara, seeking warmth and safety, and in that small gesture, the complexity of what they faced became painfully clear. This little life was caught in the crossfire of forces far beyond its understanding, and somehow, so were they all. Thomas's jaw clenched as a storm of emotions churned beneath his skin, fear mingling with frustration, guilt gnawing at the edges of his resolve. He had come here seeking escape, a reprieve from his own haunted memories, and now the ghosts of that past stood before him, alive and demanding reckoning. It was as though the forest itself were mocking his attempts to outrun what he could never forget. Ilara's breath hitched, a sharp intake that betrayed the fragile mask of control she wore so carefully. Her fingers tightened imperceptibly around the cub, nails pressing faint crescents into soft fur. For all her strength, the vulnerability in her stance was undeniable. An exposed nerve that Thomas felt drawn to, yet feared disturbing. The years away from this place had not dulled the pain etched deep into her bones. She lifted her gaze slowly, meeting Thomas's eyes with a flicker of something unspoken, regret, perhaps, or a silent plea for understanding. "I thought I left it all behind," she murmured, voice barely above the rustle of leaves. "But it's never really gone. It waits." Her words hung between them, heavy and raw. Thomas's chest tightened again, the old ache flaring with a sudden sharpness. He knew that feeling all too well, the relentless pull of history, the way past wounds fester beneath the surface, refusing to heal on their own. He had tried to bury his own ghosts beneath layers of distance and silence, but now the ground beneath those walls was crumbling fast. The stranger shifted uneasily, the carved wooden box clutched tightly in his trembling hands. His eyes darted nervously toward the shadows, as if expecting enemies to materialize from the darkness at any moment. The tension in his posture was a mirror of their own, a shared fear that transcended words. Thomas felt the weight of that collective anxiety settle like a stone in his gut. A sudden gust swept through the trees, scattering dry leaves and sending a shiver racing down Thomas's spine. The night air felt colder now, sharper, an unwelcome reminder that time was slipping away, that the fragile hope they'd found in the cub's rescue was just the beginning of a far darker journey. The forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows deepening into silent witnesses of their unease. Thomas's breath came in shallow, uneven pulls, his lungs tightening as if struggling to hold on to calm. His hands, rough and scarred, clenched into fists at his sides before trembling minutely, betraying the fierce turmoil within. Every instinct screamed to act, to protect, to fix what had been broken, yet the paralysis of uncertainty held him fast. How could he fight a shadow he barely understood? Ilara's voice broke the silence, brittle but resolute. "We have to find her." The words were simple, but beneath them lay a storm of determination and dread. Her eyes flicked toward Thomas, searching, challenging, daring him to meet the gravity of what lay ahead. He nodded slowly, the choice settling like cold iron in his veins. "We will." But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at the edges of his conviction. Was he ready to face the ghosts of his past? To confront the darkness that had chased them both into these woods? The cub stirred in Ilara's arms, its tiny body pressing closer, as if sensing the shifting tides around them. Its amber eyes, wide and luminous, reflected the faint glow of distant stars, a fragile beacon in the encroaching night. In that moment, Thomas saw not just an animal, but a symbol of all they stood to lose, and all they might yet save. Ilara's gaze softened briefly as she looked down at the cub, then hardened again as she turned back to Thomas and the stranger. "We'll need to move carefully," she said, voice low but steady. "The black pines are ruthless. They don't just hunt, they erase." The words sent a chill through Thomas's spine. Erase. The thought was more terrifying than any physical threat, a reminder of how easily lives could be shattered, memories wiped clean and people lost forever, not just to the forest but to oblivion. He swallowed, feeling the fragile threads of hope and fear intertwine within him. The man's revelations had cracked open everything he thought he knew, about this place, about Ilara, about himself. The path ahead was no longer a simple crossing, but a descent into a darkness that promised to change them all. And yet, despite the weight of it all, Thomas felt something else stirring beneath the surface. A quiet, stubborn ember of resolve. They might be outnumbered, outmatched, and overwhelmed, but they were not broken. Not yet. The forest around them seemed to respond, the wind whispering through the pines like a cautious breath, the shadows shifting but not swallowing. The night was vast, indifferent, but within its depths, a fragile spark of connection had been lit between man, woman, and cub, a fragile alliance forged in fear, hope, and the unyielding will to survive. Thomas exhaled slowly, the sound steadying him. Whatever demons haunted these woods, whatever pain and loss awaited, he would not turn away. Not now. Not when the fragile thread of hope was all they had left. The bridge groaned faintly beneath their feet, a reminder that every step forward carried risk. But together, with the cub nestled safely between them, they would face the darkness. They had no choice. The night was far from over. Thomas stepped away from the fragile circle of light beneath the bridge, retreating into the shadowed embrace of the forest. The wolf cub nestled in Ilara's arms was momentarily out of sight, and with it, the immediate urgency of their plight seemed to dissolve, leaving him alone with the ghostly whispers of his own mind. The night wrapped around him like a dense shroud, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the quiet punctuated only by the distant rustle of unseen creatures stirring in the underbrush. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, but the air felt heavy, as if laden with memories best left buried. Inside, a storm churned, conflicting tides of guilt and relief battling beneath his ribs. The relief was raw, almost shameful, a flicker of gratitude that the cub had survived, that the fragile thread of hope still held. But beneath it lay the heavier weight of guilt, the nagging question of why he had hesitated, why he had not acted sooner, and what ghosts from his past had kept him frozen on the bridge's edge. His hands trembled slightly, the invisible scars from years ago suddenly aching, as if reopened by the night's revelations. The forest around him seemed to breathe in rhythm with his own faltering heartbeat. Each breath carried the scent of moss and resin, mingling with a faint, metallic tang that tugged at something deep within his memory. It was a scent he hadn't noticed in years, not since he was a boy running through these woods with reckless abandon, before the shadows crept in. That smell, the mingling of earth and blood, unlocked a door in his mind, and suddenly he was back in a dimly lit cabin, the walls echoing with the muffled sobs of a child, no longer sheltered by innocence. Thomas's fingers traced a ghostly pattern in the air, as if trying to catch the fragments of those long-forgotten moments. He could see the cracked wooden floorboards, feel the cold bite of winter seeping through the thin glass panes. A memory floated up, his mother's voice, fragile and trembling, whispering promises she could no longer keep. The ache of those lost years, The silence that followed filled his chest with a hollow ache. He had buried those memories deep, convinced that distance and time could erase the pain. But here, in the dark heart of the forest, they surged back with relentless clarity. He opened his eyes slowly, the darkness now more profound, pressing in like a living thing. The moon, a pale sliver behind a veil of clouds, cast a faint, flickering glow through the branches. Shadows danced across the rough bark of ancient pines, their twisted forms mirroring the turmoil within him. The silence was no longer comforting. It was accusatory, demanding reckoning. Thomas felt the invisible chains of his past tighten, pulling him toward a truth he had long resisted, that he was no longer the man who had fled these woods, nor the one who had stood frozen on that bridge. The image of Ilara's face lingered in his mind. Her eyes, fierce and haunted, a reflection of his own fractured soul. She carried burdens he could barely glimpse, but somehow they intertwined with his. The wolf cub, fragile and trembling, embodied more than survival. It was a symbol of the fragile legacy they both carried, a testament to love and loss entwined. Thomas realized, with a sudden, piercing clarity, that this small creature was a mirror of himself, vulnerable yet stubbornly alive, caught between worlds. His gaze drifted to the rough bark beneath his fingertips, the texture grounding him in the present, even as his thoughts spiraled. He remembered a photograph tucked away in a forgotten drawer, a faded image of a family once whole, smiles frozen in time. He had never dared to look at it since the day it shattered his world. The thought of it now was almost unbearable, yet irresistible. He imagined pulling it out, the edges worn soft from years of untouched memory, the faces blurred but unyielding in their silent demand for acknowledgement. A soft breeze stirred the leaves overhead, their rustling a fragile hymn to the past and the future entwined. Thomas's breath caught as a single leaf drifted down, landing lightly on his outstretched palm. Its veins, delicate and intricate, spoke of resilience, born from fragility shaped by time. The symbolism was not lost on him. Like the leaf, he was caught in a moment of transition, fragile yet poised to endure, to shift, to grow beyond the confines of his fears. The internal dialogue was relentless. Doubt gnawed at him. Was he capable of facing what lay ahead? Could he protect the cub, Ilara, and perhaps himself from the darkness encroaching on all sides? Yet, beneath the doubt, a stubborn thread of instinct pulsed, a primal will to fight, to reclaim, to heal. It was a quiet voice, nearly drowned out by the cacophony of his fears, but unmistakably present. He realized that survival was no longer just physical. It was a battle for identity, for the right to hope and to belong. His mind drifted to his own family, the fractured ties that had pulled him away, the unspoken words that had festered like open wounds. Love, he understood now, was not always a balm. Sometimes it was a source of pain, of complicated legacies inherited and passed down like scars. Yet, it was also the force that tethered him to this moment, to the cub, to Ilara, and to the fragile possibility of redemption. Thomas's footsteps echoed softly on the forest floor as he moved slowly back toward the bridge, drawn by a force he could not name. The creaking wood beneath his boots was a reminder of the tenuous balance they all walked, a bridge between past and future, fear and hope, isolation and connection. He paused, the silence wrapping around him like a shroud, and for the first time in a long while, allowed himself to feel the full weight of everything he had tried to escape. He did not speak. No words could capture the complexity swirling within. Instead, he let the silence stretch, thick, heavy, yet strangely cleansing. The night held him in its embrace, a witness to his quiet reckoning. He knew deep down that the man who had stood frozen on the bridge was gone, replaced by someone fractured but unbroken, vulnerable but determined. Thomas's hand brushed against the rough wood of the bridge's railing, grounding him in the moment. The cub's distant whimper echoed faintly, a fragile sound, a reminder of the stakes, of the fragile spark of life that demanded their courage. He inhaled deeply, the chill of the night biting at his lungs but clearing the fog of doubt. In the stillness, a subtle resolve began to take root, not a certainty, but a willingness to confront the shadows within and without. The path ahead remained shrouded in darkness, the threats looming large, but Thomas felt the fragile stirrings of change. He could no longer return to who he was before. The past had caught him, and now it demanded a reckoning. The forest whispered its ancient secrets around him, the night air thick with possibility and pain. And in that quiet, intimate crisis, Thomas understood that survival was more than endurance. It was transformation. The fragile hope born beneath the bridge was not just for the cub or for Ilara, but for himself. The journey inward had begun. The forest seemed to hold its breath, darkness folding in tighter around the trio beneath the bridge, the air thickening with a tension so palpable it pressed on Thomas's chest like a weight. The wolf cub, nestled protectively in Ilara's arms, trembled, not from the cold, but from an instinctive fear that rippled through the night. Thomas felt a sudden, sharp prickling at the nape of his neck, a warning he hadn't anticipated after the long hours of silence and reflection. The fragile calm was fracturing, and he could sense the first crack splintering beneath the surface. Before anyone could speak, a sharp, metallic clang echoed through the stillness, shattering the fragile bubble of quiet. Thomas's heart slammed against his ribs as he spun toward the sound, eyes scanning the dense shadows beyond the bridge's edge. His breath caught, cold and ragged. As movement flickered between the trees, a figure cloaked in darkness stepped forward with deliberate slowness. "Who's there?" Thomas's voice was rough, a raw edge surfacing that surprised even him. His fingers curled into fists, knuckles whitening as adrenaline surged through his veins. The forest, once a sanctuary of whispered secrets, had morphed into a trap, the shadows now alive with unseen threats. The figure hesitated, then spoke, voice low and gravelly. "You shouldn't be here." Ilara's grip on the cub tightened, her body shifting, every muscle coiled like a spring ready to snap. She stepped forward, eyes narrowing into slits, the ancient calm she'd carried moments ago now replaced by a fierce, guarded fire. "Who are you?" Her voice was sharp, brittle with a tension that bespoke years of pain and mistrust. "I'm just a messenger," the man said, stepping fully into the dim light, revealing a gaunt face lined with dirt and sweat. His eyes darted nervously between Thomas and Ilara. "The black pines know you're here. They're closer than you think." A cold shiver ran down Thomas's spine. The name, the weight behind it, settled over them like a storm cloud. "Closer?" His voice cracked, disbelief mingling with rising panic. "How?" "We haven't moved from this spot." The man's gaze hardened. "They don't need to be seen to be dangerous. They've been watching, waiting. You're not just trespassing anymore. You're a threat." Ilara's jaw clenched, her usual composure unraveling just enough to reveal the deep scars beneath. "What do they want with us? With the cub?" Her voice wavered, betraying the dread she tried so desperately to hide. "They want control," the man said grimly, "of the forest, of the secrets it hides, and of everyone who tries to protect them. The cub, it's more than an animal. It's a symbol, and symbols can ignite wars." Thomas's mind reeled. The fragile hope they'd nurtured since the cub's fall was now a beacon, a danger drawing all eyes in the dark. He glanced at Ilara, searching her face for any sign of reassurance, but found only a storm of conflicted emotions, fear, anger, and something deeper, a vulnerability she rarely allowed to surface. Suddenly, the sound of snapping twigs erupted from the underbrush behind them. The man's eyes widened in alarm. "They're coming!" Thomas's instinct screamed at him to run, to vanish into the forest's shadowed arms, but something held him rooted, a stubborn thread of responsibility woven through the chaos. Ilara's body tensed beside him, the cub pressed tightly against her chest, as if drawing strength from the small life she protected. "We need to move," Ilara said, her voice low but urgent. "Now." Thomas nodded, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. "But where? We don't even know the terrain well enough to outrun them." The man pointed a trembling finger toward a barely visible trail disappearing into the blackness. "There's an old logging road. It's risky, but it's our best chance. The black pines avoid it because of the unstable ground." Ilara hesitated, eyes flickering with doubt. "Unstable ground means danger of its own." Better danger than being caught, Thomas said, voice hardening as the reality sank in. We don't have a choice. As if to underscore his words, the forest around them seemed to shift, the wind rising abruptly, rustling the leaves into a frenzy, carrying with it whispers of unseen movement. The cub whimpered, a soft, trembling sound that pierced the growing cacophony. Ilara's gaze locked onto Thomas's. We're risking more than just our lives tonight. He swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling heavily. The fragile alliance they'd begun to forge was now tested, stretched thin against the backdrop of encroaching danger. Trust, already a fragile commodity between them, felt like it might snap under the strain. Without warning, the stranger pulled a worn knife from beneath his jacket, the blade catching the sparse moonlight. We'll need protection. They won't hesitate. Thomas's eyes narrowed. Who exactly are you? Why should we trust you? The man's jaw tightened, a flicker of pain crossing his features. Because I'm the only one who wants to see them stopped. Because I know what they're capable of. Ilara's voice was cold, slicing through the tension. And what about when you're the one who betrays us? The man flinched as if struck. I'm not your enemy. But the doubt lingered like poison in the air. Thomas felt it coil within him. A growing suspicion that this stranger's arrival was as much a complication as the hunters themselves. The forest around them seemed to narrow, the towering pines closing in like sentinels guarding secrets best left alone. A sudden piercing howl shattered the night, wild, desperate, and echoing through the dense woods. The cub's ears flattened, body stiffening. Ilara's breath caught, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fierce defiance. They're close, she whispered, voice trembling but resolute. We don't have time. Thomas's pulse thundered in his ears. He glanced once more at the stranger, then at Ilara, the weight of the moment pressing down with unbearable urgency. The fragile hope that had flickered into life beneath the bridge was now a flickering flame on the verge of being snuffed out. With a sudden, impulsive surge, Thomas stepped forward, voice sharp and urgent. No more secrets. No more silence. If we're going to survive this, we need everything right now. Ilara's eyes met his, a silent battle waging between trust and fear. The stranger's gaze flickered, shadows deepening behind his eyes. The forest held its breath, the night thick with the scent of pine, earth, and something darker. Betrayal, perhaps, or the promise of violence yet to come. The fragile bonds were unraveling, and the true fight was just beginning. The stranger's words hung heavy in the night air, their weight pressing on Thomas like the dense shadows pooling between the trees. As the man retreated a few steps into the dim light, Thomas's eyes caught the carved wooden box still clutched tightly in his trembling hands. At first glance, it seemed a simple keepsake, but now, illuminated by the flickering moonlight, its worn edges and faintly inscribed symbols took on a new, unsettling significance. A sudden memory flickered in Thomas's mind, Ilara's fingers from earlier, brushing gently over the cub's fur, her touch both fierce and tender. There had been a hesitation in that moment, a flicker of something unspoken, perhaps guilt or a secret burden she'd carried too long. The box in the stranger's hands felt like a key, invisible threads pulling at the fragile tapestry of their shared history. Ilara shifted, her gaze sharp yet distant. That box, she murmured, voice low and tight. It belonged to her. Thomas's breath caught. The stranger's eyes flickered with recognition, a shadow passing swiftly across his gaunt face. I kept it safe, he said quietly. When she was taken, I took it from their camp. It's all that's left. The weight of those words settled between them, thickening the night's tension. Thomas felt the fragile bonds they'd begun to form stretch taut, threatening to snap. The past was no longer a distant echo. It was a living, breathing force entwined with every heartbeat, every decision. A sudden rustle to their left pulled Thomas from his thoughts. His eyes darted to the underbrush, where a vague silhouette crouched low, watching. The stranger's gaze hardened. They've been here, he hissed, more than once, watching, waiting. Thomas's mind raced, the fragments of his own past colliding with the present danger. Years ago, before the silence and the distance, He had known this forest intimately, not just its trails and trees, but its secrets, its hidden dangers. A boy once fearless, now a man gripped by doubt and haunted by shadows he thought long buried. "Why didn't you tell me?" Thomas's voice cracked, the raw edge of betrayal surfacing. "You knew about the hunters, the black pines. All this time." Ilara's eyes darkened, a flicker of pain flashing through her guarded expression. "I tried to keep you away," she whispered, because I hoped if you stayed distant, you'd be safe." Her words pierced deeper than any blade. Thomas clenched his fists, the old ache in his chest flaring anew. Safety had always been an illusion, a fragile veneer over a chasm of fear and loss. The wolf cub whimpered softly, nestling closer to Ilara. It was more than an animal now. It was a living testament to their entwined fates, a fragile spark illuminating the dark corners of their shared history. Thomas's gaze fell to the box again. He stepped forward, curiosity mingling with a growing sense of dread. The carvings, once meaningless scratches, now revealed themselves as symbols of protection and loss, etched by hands desperate to preserve memory against erasure. "Who carved these?" he asked, voice barely above a breath. Ilara's lips pressed into a thin line. Her father, before everything fell apart. The revelation hit Thomas like a wave, a father lost to the forest's merciless grip, a family shattered by unseen wars. The pieces of their story began to coalesce, threading through time and pain. "I remember," Thomas said slowly, voice thick with emotion. "A boy, a cabin, a winter night. The smell of pine and blood." Ilara's eyes met his, the vulnerability raw and unmasked for a fleeting moment. "You were there," she said softly. "You saw it. You remember more than you think." The past surged forward, unbidden but undeniable. Thomas's mind replayed fractured images, shadows moving between trees, muffled cries, the cold bite of fear that had gripped his young heart. He had fled then, hoping distance would drown the memories. But now, those buried moments clawed their way back with relentless clarity. A sudden gust swept through the clearing, carrying the scent of damp earth and something metallic, a cruel reminder of unfinished business. The forest, once a place of refuge, now felt like a cage tightening with every breath. The stranger shifted uneasily, breaking the fragile silence. "There's more you don't know," he said, voice low. "The black pines, they're tied to all this. To your past, to hers, to the cubs." Thomas's heart thundered. "How? What do they want with us?" The man's eyes darkened. "Control. Power. They're hunters of more than just animals. They seek to erase histories, to rewrite stories. The cub symbolizes something they fear, a chance for reckoning." Ilara's hands trembled as she clutched the cub. "They want to silence us," she whispered. "To bury the truth beneath these trees." Thomas felt the weight of their shared legacy pressing down, a labyrinth of pain and hope intertwined. The fragile alliance they'd forged was now a crucible, testing loyalties, exposing wounds, demanding sacrifices. He glanced at Ilara, searching for certainty in her storm-tossed eyes. "We're caught in something bigger than us," he said, voice steady despite the turmoil. "But maybe that's why we have to fight." Her nod was slow, resolute. For her, for the cub, for the past we can't undo, but can face. The forest seemed to lean in closer, the night thick with whispered promises and threats. Thomas's gaze flicked back to the wooden box, an unassuming relic now heavy with meaning, a testament to loss, love, and the fragile hope that refused to die. As the distant howl of a wolf rose once more, threading through the trees like a mournful song, Thomas understood that their battle was no longer just against hunters or shadows. It was a reckoning with themselves, their pasts, their fears, their fragile humanity. The bridge beneath their feet groaned softly, a reminder of the precarious balance they walked. Thomas's fingers brushed the rough wood, grounding him in the present, even as the past surged around him. No one was who they seemed. No secrets were small enough to ignore. And the true enemy might be the silence that had kept them apart for so long. The night had shifted, the stakes were clearer, and the fragile thread that bound them all was taut, ready to snap or to hold. In that moment, Thomas realized the truth he'd been running from. He was not merely a bystander, but a part of the story's darkest heart. The fall of the cub had been a beginning, a spark that ignited a long-buried fire. And now there was no turning back. The night pressed down like a suffocating weight, the forest's breath shallow and uneven as Thomas stood on the edge of the clearing, the faint glow of the moon barely piercing the thick canopy above. His hands trembled at his sides, fingers curling and uncurling in restless anticipation. The wooden box lay at his feet, a silent testament to a past he had tried so desperately to forget, a past that now clawed back with merciless clarity. He swallowed hard, the dry scrape of his throat the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. Around him, the trees loomed like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching long and distorted, twisting in the faint, flickering light. The wolf cub nestled in Ilara's arms let out a soft whimper, its small body tense, as if it too sensed the fracture rippling through the night. Thomas's gaze dropped to the carved symbols etched into the box's weathered surface. They were strange, ancient, almost hypnotic in their intricate patterns. Each line seemed to pulse beneath his fingertips, a subtle thrum of memory and pain. He had seen those carvings before, in fleeting dreams, in half-remembered moments from his childhood, but never quite understood their weight until now. They're tied to her. Ilara's voice was barely a whisper, fragile yet resolute. She stood close, but not close enough, as if the distance between them was a chasm neither dared cross. Her eyes, dark pools reflecting a storm of grief and determination, met his briefly before flickering away to the shadows beyond. Thomas's chest tightened, a cold ache spreading through his ribs. "Why didn't you tell me everything?" His voice cracked, the words raw and uneven, as if each syllable tore through him. "Why did you carry this alone?" Ilara's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands tightening around the trembling cub. "Because I thought it would keep you safe, because I hoped distance would be enough to bury the past." But it wasn't. A silence stretched between them, thick and unyielding, filled only by the distant rustle of leaves and the cub's soft breathing. Thomas felt the weight of that silence like a physical blow, a barrier forged from years of pain and mistrust. The woman he once thought he knew stood before him now as a stranger, cloaked in shadows, her secrets as deep and dark as the forest itself. He took a step back, the rough wood of the bridge creaking beneath his boots, a reminder of the fragile ground they all stood on. The chill in the air seeped into his bones, sharp and insistent, as if the night itself demanded reckoning. His breath fogged in the cold, each exhale a fragile thread hanging in the dark. I can't be part of this if it means losing you," Thomas whispered, the admission trembling in the quiet. "Not again." Ilara's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her voice was steady, unwavering. "We've already lost too much. Running isn't an option anymore." The words hung heavy, sealing a truth neither wanted to face. The path behind them was shattered, and the road ahead was lined with shadows that promised no mercy. Thomas felt the old walls around his heart crumble, walls built from fear, regret, and the desperate hope that some things could be left in the past. His gaze drifted upward, catching the faint flicker of stars through the branches. They seemed distant, cold, indifferent to the turmoil below. The forest was vast, endless, a reminder of how small and fragile he truly was. Yet within that vastness, a spark ignited, a stubborn ember of resolve refusing to be extinguished. A sudden movement caught his eye, a flicker of shadow slipping between the trees. The stranger's warning echoed in his mind. They were being watched, hunted. The black pines were closer than ever, their presence a dark stain spreading across the wilderness. Thomas's hands clenched into fists, nails biting into his palms until the skin threatened to break. The choice lay bare before him now, retreat into the shadows of his past, or step forward into a future steeped in uncertainty and danger. The cub's soft whimper pulled at him, a fragile plea that mirrored his own fractured hope. "Ilara," he began, voice steady despite the storm within, "whatever comes next, We face it together. No more running, no more silence. She nodded slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just enough to reveal the fragile bond they had begun to forge. Yet beneath the surface, Thomas sensed the undercurrent of doubt, an unspoken question hanging between them like a fragile thread. Would their alliance hold when the darkness closed in? The wooden box at his feet seemed to pulse with an unseen rhythm, a heartbeat entwined with their own. Thomas knelt, fingers brushing the rough carvings, grounding himself in the moment. The past and present collided in a painful clarity. There was no going back. His thoughts flickered to the photograph he had once hidden away. A family fractured, a life abandoned. The image was a ghost haunting the edges of his mind, a reminder of all that had been lost and all that still demanded reckoning. The forest around them seemed to close in, the night thick with whispered threats and fragile promises. The wolf cub nestled deeper into Ilara's arms, its amber eyes reflecting the faint glow of dawn's first light, a fragile beacon amid encroaching darkness. Thomas rose slowly, the weight of inevitability pressing down on him like the heavy branches overhead. The bridge beneath their feet groaned softly, as if mourning the innocence lost, the fragile hope now forged into a solemn vow. He met Ilara's gaze once more. No words needed. The line had been crossed, the threshold passed. The quiet devastation they shared was a bond stronger than fear, a promise etched in the shadows of the forest. The final act waited beyond the trees, its breath hot and unforgiving, and Thomas knew, with a clarity that cut deeper than any wound, that the life he had once known was gone forever. Thomas stood at the edge of the clearing, the carved wooden box heavy in his hands, its weight far greater than its size suggested. The night air was thick, almost suffocating, as if the forest itself had tightened its grip, closing in around them. Behind him, Ilara's steady breathing was the only sound anchoring him to the present, a fragile tether to a world that felt increasingly unrecognizable. The wolf cub stirred in her arms, its amber eyes reflecting the faint moonlight, a glimmer of innocence caught in the shadow of looming threats. The moment had settled on him like a stone. He could no longer drift through this tangled web of secrets and half-truths, no longer stand frozen on the threshold of action. The past was no longer distant. It was here. It was now. And it demanded reckoning. He inhaled deeply, the cold air biting at his lungs, sharpening his thoughts. "We can't wait any longer," Thomas said, voice low but steady, breaking the tense silence. "If the black pines are watching, if they're hunting us, then hiding won't save anyone." His eyes locked onto Ilara's, searching for any sign of hesitation. Instead, he found something fiercer, a reflection of his own resolve. Ilara nodded slowly, her grip on the cub tightening. "I've spent years running from this, trying to bury the past under layers of silence and solitude." Her voice wavered, raw with the weight of old pain. "But they're not just shadows anymore. They're real here, and they want us silenced." Thomas's fingers clenched around the box, the carved symbols seeming to pulse beneath his skin, a reminder of what was at stake. "Then we fight, not just for survival, but for the truth, for her, for the cub." His voice dropped to a whisper, laden with iron and vulnerability. "But we do it on our terms." A sudden rustle from the underbrush snapped their attention to the darkness beyond the clearing. The stranger who had brought them this grim news stepped forward, eyes darting nervously. "The black pines won't wait for you to be ready. They'll come at dawn, and they won't stop until they've erased every trace." His words hung in the air like a guillotine's blade, sharp and foreboding. Thomas met the man's gaze without flinching. "Then we make the first move. We take the fight to them." His jaw tightened, the years of pain and loss coalescing into a fierce determination. No more running, no more hiding. Ilara's breath caught, her eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and defiance. "That means risking everything, our lives, the cub's safety, maybe even what little of ourselves we have left." Thomas stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near murmur. "I've lost too much to turn back now. The past has been chasing me, but tonight, I choose to face it head-on. Whatever comes next, I won't let it break me." The cub whimpered softly, as if sensing the shift in the air. its small body pressing closer into Ilara's arms. The moonlight broke through the canopy in a sudden shaft, illuminating the clearing like a spotlight, casting long, flickering shadows that danced on the rough bark of the ancient trees. It was as if the forest itself was bearing witness to this moment, the crossing of a threshold from fear into action, from hesitation into reckoning. Ilara exhaled, her voice steadier now. "We start at first light, we find her, and we end this." Thomas nodded, the finality of her words settling deep in his bones. Together. The stranger stepped back, disappearing into the darkness with a warning glance over his shoulder. The forest grew silent once more, but the tension remained. A taut wire stretched to its breaking point. Thomas looked down at the wooden box again, then lifted his gaze to the stars peeking through the night sky. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, fraught with danger and uncertainty. But the fragile hope that had sparked beneath the bridge was now a burning flame, one that would not be snuffed out. He felt the weight of the past, the present and the future converge within him. A crucible where fear, love, and courage intertwined. The bridge had been crossed. There was no turning back, and as the first cold light of dawn began to seep through the trees, Thomas, Ilara, and the cub stepped forward, into the unknown, into the storm that awaited them. The fight was no longer a choice. It was inevitable. The forest's breath had slowed to a near whisper, the usual chorus of nocturnal life silenced beneath a heavy, suffocating stillness. Thomas stood motionless, the carved wooden box clenched tightly in his hands, its rough edges biting into his skin as if reminding him of the weight he now bore. Every muscle in his body was taut, coiled like a spring ready to snap, yet he dared not move. Around him, shadows lengthened and deepened, swallowing the faint glow of the moon, folding the clearing into an abyssal cradle of uncertainty. Ilara's silhouette was barely visible against the darkened trees, her figure rigid as if carved from stone. She held the wolf cub closer still, the small creature's quiet breaths a fragile heartbeat against the encroaching void. Her eyes, sharp and unreadable, flicked toward Thomas only once before retreating into the distant blackness beyond the clearing. They shared no words, none could cut through the thick tension that had settled like a shroud, but in that look was an unspoken understanding. The fragile alliance they'd forged was now a fragile tether stretched to its breaking point. The stranger lingered on the clearing's edge, his gaunt face swallowed by shadows, eyes darting nervously, betraying the storm of fear and guilt within. His presence was a volatile thread in the tight weave of uncertainty, a reminder that threats could emerge not just from the forest's depths, but from the fragile human bonds that held this precarious group together. Thomas felt his gaze drawn to the man's trembling hands, the subtle quiver betraying a resolve buckling under invisible pressure. A long silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, as if the very air had been squeezed from the night. Thomas's breath came shallow, each inhale a rasp against his tightening throat. Time warped. Minutes bled into an eternity. The forest around them frozen in suspended animation. The rustling leaves, the distant calls of owls, even the cub's soft whimpers seemed muted, swallowed by the oppressive weight pressing down from every direction. Thomas's eyes flicked to the wooden box once more, tracing the intricate carvings that seemed to pulse faintly in the darkness. It was a relic of loss and memory, a barrier both literal and symbolic between the past they could not escape and the uncertain future that awaited. His fingers tightened around it reflexively, the knuckles whitening beneath the skin. The box was a silent sentinel, holding secrets that could shatter or save them all. Ilara's voice finally broke the silence, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the gloom like a blade. "They're coming," she said, the words heavy with dread and defiance. Her gaze was fixed on the forest's edge, where shadows seemed to gather like storm clouds poised to unleash fury. There was no panic in her tone, only a cold, unyielding resolve that made the cold bite sharper against Thomas's skin. Thomas nodded, swallowing the lump lodged deep in his throat. "We can't hide. Not now." The confession was raw, a surrender to the inevitability pressing in from all sides, yet beneath it lay a flicker of stubborn courage, a refusal to be consumed by the darkness without a fight. His eyes searched Ilara's face, seeking the faintest glimmer of hope amid the gathering storm. A sudden breeze stirred the branches overhead, scattering a shower of dry leaves that fluttered down like fragile ash, their brittle rustle the only sound daring to break the suffocating quiet. The forest seemed to lean in closer, its ancient sentinels looming like silent judges, their twisted limbs reaching out in warning or accusation. Time itself felt brittle. Each heartbeat echoed like a drumbeat in a vast, empty chamber. The wolf cub shifted in Ilara's arms, its amber eyes wide and luminous in the dim light, reflecting a spark of wild, unyielding life. In that flicker, Thomas saw not just vulnerability, but a challenge, a fragile flame daring the darkness to consume it. The moment stretched taut, a breath held in the throat of the night, waiting for the inevitable fracture. Words faltered and died before they could form. The unspoken fears, the suppressed rage, the simmering dread, all hung heavy in the spaces between them. The fragile thread that bound them strained under the weight of what was to come. No one moved. No one dared speak. The forest waited. So did they. The night exploded into chaos without warning. A sudden guttural roar ripped through the silence, shattering the fragile stillness like glass. Thomas's heart slammed against his ribs as he spun toward the source, eyes wide, breath caught in his throat. The black pines had arrived, an invisible storm crashing down, tearing apart the tenuous thread of safety they'd clung to. "Ilara!" he shouted, voice raw and desperate. But she was already moving, her body coiled and fierce, the cub pressed tightly against her chest as if it were the only anchor left to hold her steady. The stranger vanished into the shadows, swallowed by the forest's hungry darkness. Then, in the midst of the chaos, a voice, cold, cruel, impossibly familiar, cut through the turmoil like a knife. "Well, well," it sneered, stepping into the clearing's dim light. The figure was tall, gaunt, eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger that froze Thomas's blood. "Look who's come crawling back!" Thomas staggered, the world tilting beneath him as the man's face snapped into focus. It was Mark, a ghost from his past he had tried so hard to bury, the man who had haunted his nightmares, the architect of the fractures that had splintered his life apart. "You," Thomas whispered, shaking, rage and fear tangled in his chest, a storm he could no longer hold back. Mark smiled, a twisted, merciless curl of lips. "Did you really think you could hide here? That the past wouldn't find you?" Ilara's eyes blazed, but even her defiance faltered under the weight of the moment. "Why?" she demanded, voice cracking. "Why destroy everything? Why take her?" Mark's gaze flicked to the wolf cub, then back to Ilara. "It's never been about the girl. It's about control, power, and you, both of you, are obstacles." Thomas's fists clenched so tightly, his nails bit into his palms. The past wasn't just chasing him anymore. It had caught him, encircled him, stripped away every illusion. "Everything I've tried to forget," he said, voice breaking. "Everything I ran from. It's here. It's you." Mark stepped closer, the air thick with menace. "You belong to this forest as much as I do, we all do, and now it's time to pay your debts." Thomas's knees buckled, the weight of years crashing down in an unbearable wave. He sank to the ground, the carved wooden box slipping from his grasp, tumbling open to reveal the faded photograph inside. A family fractured, a past shattered. Tears stung his eyes as the final pieces of his carefully constructed denial shattered like brittle glass. "Why didn't you tell me?" Thomas sobbed, voice raw and ragged. "Why did you let me drown in silence?" Ilara knelt beside him, her own tears falling freely now. "Because the truth was too heavy. Because I thought protecting you meant keeping it buried. But the truth was a wildfire now, consuming everything in its path. The fragile hope, the tentative trust. It all lay in ruins beneath the dark canopy." Mark's laughter echoed, cold and merciless. "There's no salvation here, only reckoning." Thomas looked up, eyes blazing with a newfound clarity, fierce and unyielding. "Then we fight. Not because we have a choice, but because we refuse to be broken." Ilara nodded, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "For her, for the cub, for what's left of us." The forest seemed to pulse with their resolve, shadows retreating before the fierce light of their defiance. The night would never be the same, and neither would they. The first light of dawn filtered gently through the canopy, casting soft, trembling rays over the broken bridge where it had all begun. Thomas stood alone now, the wolf cub safely nestled in Ilara's arms as she tended to the fragile wounds of their shared past. Silence hung heavy between them, a silence not born of absence, but of everything spoken and left unsaid. He traced his fingers along the rough wood of the railing, feeling its grain beneath his skin like a pulse. Steady, enduring, quietly resilient. The bridge, once a threshold between worlds, now felt less like a crossing and more like a mirror. It reflected the distance he had traveled, not in miles but through the labyrinth of his own heart. The man who had frozen in fear that night, watching a tiny life teeter on the edge, was gone. In his place stood someone fractured but awake, someone willing to carry the weight of memory and hope entwined. The echo of the cub's fall, once a crack of terror in the night, had transformed into a fragile beacon, a reminder that survival is not the absence of fear, but the courage to face it. Thomas's breath caught as he recalled that desperate cry, now softened by the understanding that life, in all its fragility, insists on being heard. Ilara approached quietly, her eyes steady but softened by the unspoken reconciliation between them. "We carry more than scars," she said, voice low, "but also stories worth telling, if we dare to listen." He nodded, the ache inside him no longer a hollow absence, but a tender wound beginning to heal. The carved wooden box, now resting at his feet, seemed less like a relic of loss and more like a testament to the endurance of love, its symbols no longer inscrutable but sacred marks of survival. The forest around them stirred gently, a breeze weaving through the ancient pines as if whispering benedictions. Somewhere, a lone wolf's howl drifted across the morning mist, neither a warning nor a lament, but a song of persistence and belonging. It was the wildness they had feared and yet ultimately embraced. Thomas's gaze lifted to the fading stars, their cold light mingling with the warmth of dawn, a reminder that even in darkness, there is room for new beginnings. He realized that the path ahead was still shrouded in shadow, that the fight was far from over, but now he carried something deeper than fear or regret. He carried connection, the fragile, unyielding thread that had woven itself between a man, a woman, and a wolf cub on a night when everything seemed lost. Turning toward Ilara, he offered a quiet smile, less a promise, more an acknowledgement. They had faced the storm together, not to erase the past, but to live with it, to find meaning amid the ruins. As they stepped away from the bridge, the world seemed to breathe anew, the weight of silence settling softly, like the last note of a song fading into the air. Thank you for journeying with us through this story of loss, resilience, and the fragile bonds that sustain us. What would you have done in Thomas's place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to support more tales that explore the depths of the human heart. Until next time, may you find strength in your own shadows and hope in the quiet moments between.